In The Origin of Species, Darwin presented a broad range of evidence to support the concept of descent with modification. And overall, he utilized four types of data documentation to tell us about this process: direct observations, the fossil record, homology, and biogeography. Basically, scientists study data to trace the phylogeny or the evolutionary history of a species or a group of related species, and we have to use multiple sources of evidence in drawing our conclusions, determining and concerning this relationship that exists. Basically, lots of different types of evidence underlie the theory of biological evolution. And this evolutionary theory has been developed that states that all forms of life are related because of ancestry, and evidence from all aspects of life, physical structures, protein structures, sequences, help support this concept. So some people dismiss the idea as just a theory, but I don't really think they understand what the word theory means. As we've seen, the patterns of evolution have been documented directly and supported by a great deal of evidence. Darwin's explanation of the process of evolution, that natural selection is the primary cause of evolutionary change, makes sense of massive amounts of data. What's theoretical about it? The word theory has a very different meaning in science. The word theory in colloquial use is closer to the concept of a hypothesis, and in science, a theory was much more comprehensive and accounts for a much wider source of information and data. A good example of observed evolution is the rise of antibiotic resistance, including that of MRSA. Basically, MRSA is resistant not only to the antibiotics methicillin, but also to a whole host of other drugs, making it very difficult to treat. How did MRSA come from a very minor skin infection to a modern terror of hospitals and gyms? It's an ongoing struggle of natural and artificial selection driving this species forward. Basically, people used antibiotics to stop these things, but then they became the ones that didn't get killed by the antibiotics became more common, and by around and around and around and around until we get this massive increase of admissions and disease, and in some cases, death. Natural selection is an editing mechanism, not a creative force. It can act only on existing variation. It cannot create favorable traits. It selects for favorable traits that are already present in the population. That means that the gene for resistance had to exist or be mutated to exist, but once that gene exists, it can be selected for. More evidence for evolution comes from similarities in the characteristics of different organisms, and this similarity is referred to as homology. Okay, so homologous traits are the same due to common ancestry, like the bone patterns of humans and cats and whales and bats. The difference comes from chronobiological forces, heterochrony, not ancestry. Okay, analogous traits are traits that are the same because of environmental pressures. Okay, so like the shape of a fish and the shape of a swimming penguin and the shape of a whale are all similar because hydrodynamic body shapes are very limited. And then another sort of anatomical evidence that supports this is the sort of vestigial organs, or organs that had a role in our ancestors that no longer play a role, like the hind limbs of a whale. The whale doesn't walk anymore, but the bones are still there from the pelvis. Sometimes traits are going to be obvious in the embryo that are not obvious in the adult, so embryological evidence can support this idea as well. Scientists compare the anatomies of embryos in early stages, and they find some trends and data that we can look at. For example, if you look at the human embryo and the chicken embryo, there are some relationships there. The human embryo, the pharyngeal arches, like if you were looking at a fish, that would turn into gills. And in humans, they ossify and become the bones of your inner ear. The tail, those vertebrates, some of them are lost, some of them fuse into our tail bone, but those traits are there in our embryo, just like they were in our ancestors. Sometimes you can still be born with a bit of tail or that kind of thing, and that would be an atavism, those modifications where an ancestral trait reappears, but it's still part of that embryological and early life evidence that supports this concept. Biogeography is another useful tool for looking at the similarity of species, especially over long periods of time, due to studies of things like distribution and diversity of species, as well as plate tectonics. Okay, so the marsupials of Australia and the placental mammals of North America, there's a lot of convergent evolution where they're becoming similar because of niches and environmental pressures. That would be an example of a biogeographic piece of evidence. The diversity of frogs in India and Madagascar and Africa, we can track back the genetic changes to the divergence of these plates. So all the way back to Pangeic effects in some cases, we can understand and track back changes there. Another biogeographical situation is going to be ring species. A ring species is connected through a series of populations, each of which interbreed with its neighbors, with at least two end populations that are too distant to interbreed. Basically, traits that emerge, say, in the green sample can pass to the orange, to the brown, to the pink, to the blue. Okay, they can pass around as a ring, unifying them into a broader so-called meta-population. So biogeographical evidence where the geographic distribution of species affects evolution can be very helpful. And we need to realize that it's not just a spatial thing, it could be a time thing, but it is interconnected there. Paleontological evidence is what you might have thought of when you thought about evidence for the proof of species. Something like the half-life calculations of isotopes can play a role here, and there's a formula there for calculating half-life if you'd like. But really, if you have 100%, after the half-life has passed, you have 50%. After the next, 25%, and so on. You never get to zero, there's always some. So if I'm looking at living organisms to near ancestors, I might do something like carbon dating. If I'm looking at way back in time, I might do uranium because the half-life is longer. You can also look at the fossil record. You can look at bone structures that can help support that. But the fossil record is notoriously incomplete due to basically the fact that it's really hard for fossils to happen. A whole host of things have to happen for the fossil record, the fossil to exist. Okay, so even though millions of fossils have been discovered, many environmental conditions must be met, and the chance of all of these conditions coming together at one time is rare. Over long time scales, fossils can document the origin of major groups and can be a major role in this process, but it's really going to depend upon factors that are obviously outside of an organism's control. But the more common an organism is, the more hard parts they have, those things are making them more likely to fossilize. You have some complexity, though, when you start looking at bone structures and what that's going to mean for what an organism looks like. We have this idea of what something like a dinosaur might look like, but it's very biased without knowing more about the tissues that didn't fossilize, like feathers, for example, or the so-on structures. This is an example by an artist, a conceptual artist, that says if we took modern bones of organisms that we know and we followed the same pattern of diagramming that we've used for dinosaurs, this is what they would look like. We know they don't look like this, which means maybe we need to question what we think of as these organisms as well. So it's definitely something that's a little more complicated. As we're getting more and more soft tissue fossils that we're beginning to find and preserved feathers and so on, we're having some really interesting ideas about what early Earth might have looked like with these living organisms. And then the best source of evidence as far as biology is concerned is going to come from biochemistry and direct experimentation. Biochemical evidence, that could be protein sequences, DNA sequences, especially like on the bottom left here, looking at Hox genes, those master regulatory genes. Genome, the history of our evolution is recorded in our genome. And as molecular biologists are getting more and more information about this, we know that the more similar two species are, the more likely they are to be related. If we can figure out how fast, say, HIV is mutating, we can then calculate statistically how long ago the virus emerged. So we know now that the virus emerged somewhere in the 30s, not in the 80s. So there's definitely some misunderstanding about how HIV came to exist. And that so-called molecular clock can be a very useful tool. DNA and protein evidence is considered our best piece of evidence that we can do. But there's always chances that homology is really messing with our concepts. The ability of molecular trees to encompass short and long terms depends upon the rate of evolution. DNA that codes for ribosomal RNA, for example, changes relatively slowly. So DNA sequences in these genes can be compared pretty simply. And we find that mitochondrial DNA evolves relatively recently and can be used to explore recent evolutionary events, such as the relationship between groups within a species. One example is used to trace back the relationships between Native American groups, for example, using mitochondrial DNA. Direct experimental evidence is going to be controlled evidence that we can actually look at. Malaria, for example, in DDT is a great example of that pesticide resistance that emerged just like we saw with MRSA and antibiotic resistance. You can have controlled breeding populations, you can have predator-prey interactions, like with the pike cichlids and the guppies on the left. We find that whenever there is predators, the number of colors is going to be less, and when there are no predators, they're going to become more brightly colored. Why? Well, the more brightly colored ones are going to attract a mate, but they're also going to be more likely to be eaten. So that complex interaction gives us a lot of information. Natural selection is an adaptive force. It's a force that results in a better match between organisms and their environment, and it is something that we do have direct laboratory evidence to explain.